When my husband handed me divorce papers at my birthday dinner in front of 50 people, I smiled and signed them, because I'd already sold the movie rights to our marriage for $3 million. If you've ever been called a failure by someone who claimed to love you, stay with me. This gets better. The champagne was Dom Perignon, $200 a bottle, which Marcus insisted on ordering because he said my 35th birthday deserved celebrating properly. The private dining room at Bellamy's overlooked Boston Harbor, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the city lights like diamonds scattered across black velvet. I could smell the salt air mixing with expensive perfume and aged whiskey. 50 faces turned toward me as servers arranged plates of seared scallops and truffle risotto. My hands were steady as I lifted my water glass, ice cubes clicking against crystal. Even though my heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Brett sat at the opposite end of the table, laughing with his tech startup cronies, completely unaware that tonight would be the last time he'd ever laugh at my expense. His hair was perfectly styled, that intentional, messy look that took 20 minutes and $60 worth of product to achieve. He wore the navy blazer I'd bought him for his last funding pitch, the one where he'd raised $4 million for his app company, while telling investors his wife was his biggest supporter. What he didn't tell them was that I'd ghost-written his entire pitch deck, or that the market research he claimed as his own had come from 3 months of my unpaid labor, or that the supportive wife spent 18-hour days working 2 jobs while he networked at expensive restaurants and called it hustling. My best friend Caroline sat to my left, her hand finding mine under the table and squeezing 3 times. Our signal, "Are you okay?" I squeezed back 4 times. Better than okay. She didn't know everything yet. Nobody did. But in approximately 14 minutes, when dessert arrived, 50 people were about to learn exactly who Brett Ashford had been married to for 7 years, and more importantly, who he'd just lost. The woman sitting next to Brett, Madison Chen from Pearson Sterling Ventures, kept glancing at me with this expression I'd learned to recognize over the years. Pity mixed with confusion. Why does she stay? What does she see in him? I'd asked myself those same questions every single day for the past 18 months, ever since the night everything changed. Brett had always been charming in that effortless way that made people lean in when he talked. When we met at a networking event in Cambridge 8 years ago, I was 26 and working as a junior financial analyst at Merrill Lynch, pulling 70-hour weeks and living off vending machine coffee. He was 28, launching his first startup from his studio apartment, and he talked about disrupting industries like other people. Talked about the weather, natural, inevitable, already done in his mind. I fell for the vision before I fell for the man. That should have been my first warning. The proposal came 11 months later, at the Harvard Business School Mixer, where I'd just presented a market analysis that 3 venture capital firms wanted to discuss further. Brett took the microphone during the Q&A session, got down on one knee in front of 200 people, and asked me to marry him with a ring that cost more than his monthly revenue. Everyone applauded. I said yes, because saying no in front of that crowd felt impossible, because I loved him, because I genuinely believed we were building something together. The first microaggression happened 3 weeks after our wedding. We were at dinner with his co-founder Jason and 2 potential investors from Greylock Partners. I mentioned a pricing strategy I'd been analyzing for Brett's app, something about tiered subscription models that could increase customer lifetime value by 43%, based on comparable SaaS companies. Brett cut me off mid-sentence. "Babe, let's not bore everyone with the technical stuff. Why don't you tell them about that dessert you made last night?" His hand was on my knee under the table, squeezing just hard enough to hurt. The investors laughed politely and changed the subject. My chest tightened. My face burned. But I smiled and described the lemon tart, while my pricing strategy died unheard. The second came 4 months later when Brett's mother, Eleanor, visited from Greenwich. She was old money, the kind that came with hyphenated last names and summer homes that had been in the family since the 1800s. Over brunch at her country club, she asked what I did. "Sophia works in finance," Brett said before I could answer. "Nothing too demanding. Gives her flexibility to support me." I was managing a portfolio worth $47 million at the time. I said nothing. Eleanor smiled approvingly and started talking about her garden club. The third happened at our first anniversary dinner. I'd been offered a promotion to senior analyst, a $130,000 salary with a clear path to VP. It meant longer hours, but real advancement, real recognition. I told Brett over oysters at Neptune Oyster Bar, my voice bright with excitement that felt childish the second it left my mouth. He put down his fork slowly. Sophia, be realistic. If we're going to start a family, soon, does climbing the corporate ladder really make sense? My company needs me focused. I need you available. Available. Like I was a resource to be allocated. My throat closed. I felt my opportunity shrinking in real time, being compressed into something small and manageable that wouldn't threaten his orbit. I turned down the promotion the next morning. By year 2, I'd become fluent in the language of my own erasure. At investor meetings, I was Brett's wife, never Sofia Castellano, the financial analyst who built your revenue model. At his startup events, I networked for him, making connections he'd claim as his own the next day. When his best engineer quit unexpectedly, I spent 6 weeks teaching myself Python to debug his codebase at night after my day job. Brett told his board he'd fixed it himself. I watched him present my code at a tech conference and receive a standing ovation. My hands shook during the applause. Not from anger yet, from something worse, from the slow realization that I was disappearing, but I was competent. Deeply, undeniably competent in ways Brett never bothered to notice. At Merrill Lynch, I'd identified a market inefficiency in renewable energy stocks that generated $8.4 million in returns for my clients. My boss, Douglas, called it the best analytical work he'd seen in 15 years. I had 3 headhunters actively recruiting me for VP positions at Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and JP Morgan. My compensation had climbed to $215,000 annually, plus bonuses. I was managing relationships with clients who controlled billions. But at home, Brett still introduced me as someone who helped out with spreadsheets sometimes. The pattern was so gradual, I almost didn't recognize it until Caroline pointed it out over wine one Thursday night. He diminishes you constantly, Soph. Every single conversation. You know that, right? I did know. My body knew before my mind admitted it. Every time Brett spoke. Over me, my shoulders tensed. Every time he claimed credit for my work, my jaw clenched. Every time someone at his parties asked what I did, and he answered for me, my stomach twisted into knots that lasted for days. I was 28 years old, and I'd already learned to make myself smaller in every room I entered, to laugh at jokes that weren't funny, to nod when Brett explained things I understood better than he did, to watch my own expertise be repackaged as his insight. The breaking point should have destroyed me. Instead, it rebuilt me into something he never saw coming. It was a Tuesday in March when I found the email, 2:15 in the afternoon, spring rain drumming against the windows of our Beacon Hill brownstone. Brett was in San Francisco pitching Series B investors, or at least that's what he'd told me. I was working from home, analyzing quarterly reports for a client portfolio, when his laptop chimed with an incoming message. He'd left it open on the kitchen counter, still logged into his personal email account. The preview showed a name I didn't recognize, Vivian Thornton, and a subject line that made my blood stop moving. Last night was incredible. When can I see you again? My finger hovered over the trackpad. I could close the laptop, pretend I never saw it, keep living in the careful illusion I'd constructed where my marriage was just difficult, not destroyed, but something in me, something that had been compressed and silenced for 7 years, reached out and clicked. The email thread went back 9 months. 9 months of hotel reservations in San Francisco, Seattle, New York. 9 months of Brett telling me he was networking, building relationships, closing deals. 9 months of, I love you, babe, just business stuff keeping me late, while he was apparently taking Vivian Thornton, a 24-year-old marketing coordinator from his company, to restaurants I'd never heard of. The messages were explicit, detailed. He called her things he'd never called me. Promised her things he'd stopped promising me years ago. In one email from January, Brett wrote, Sophia doesn't understand me like you do. She's so focused on her little spreadsheets. She doesn't see the bigger picture. You get it. You get me. My hands were shaking so violently I had to set down my coffee mug before I dropped it. The ceramic clicked against the marble countertop, too loud in the silent apartment. I could feel my pulse in my temples, my fingertips, my chest. Not heartbreak exactly. Something colder, clearer, like a fever breaking, and suddenly I could see everything that had been blurred before. I took screenshots. Every single email, 53 messages total. I forwarded them to my personal account, then to a folder labeled Tax Documents 2019, where Brett would never think to look. Then I cleared the sent folder, deleted the forwarding evidence, and closed his laptop exactly as I'd found it. My training as a financial analyst kicked in. Automatically. Document everything. Preserve the evidence. Build the case methodically. Then I did something I'd been avoiding for 18 months. I called the headhunter from Goldman Sachs who'd been pursuing me for a VP position. His name was Richard Chen, and when he answered, I could hear the surprise in his voice. "Sophia, I was beginning to think you'd never call back." My voice was steadier than I expected. "Is the position still available?" There was a pause, papers rustling. "The VP role filled last month, but we just opened something better. Director of Emerging Markets Analysis, 280,000 base, plus performance bonus that could push you over 400. You'd be managing a team of 12 analysts. When can you interview?" I scheduled it for the following Tuesday, the day Brett was supposed to return from San Francisco. Then I called the second headhunter, the one from Morgan Stanley. Same question. She had a similar role, slightly higher. Compensation. I scheduled that interview too. Then JP Morgan. By the time I finished making calls, I had 4 interviews lined up across 3 weeks, each position more senior than what I currently held, each salary substantially higher than what Brett was paying himself from his startup. But that wasn't enough. The rage I'd been swallowing for 7 years was transforming into something more useful. Strategy. I opened my laptop and started researching divorce attorneys in Boston. Not just any attorneys. The ones who specialized in high-asset divorces involving tech entrepreneurs. The ones who knew how to value startup equity, stock options, intellectual property. I made a list of 7 names. Then I started calling. The third attorney I spoke with was named Patricia Morrison from Kendall & Price. She had silver hair and a reputation for absolutely destroying unfaithful spouses in court. Her consultation fee was $800 for 90 minutes. I booked her for Thursday morning. When I walked into her corner office overlooking Boston Common, I brought printed copies of every email, every text message, every credit card statement showing hotel charges Brett had claimed as business expenses. I brought documentation of every financial contribution I'd made to his company, every hour of unpaid labor, every piece of analysis and strategy work I'd done that he'd presented as his own. Patricia spread the documents across her conference table and studied them for 20 minutes without speaking. Finally, she looked up at me with something that might have been respect. "Mrs. Ashford, this is one of the most thoroughly documented cases I've seen in 15 years of practice. With this evidence, we can argue that you're entitled to a substantial portion of his company equity based on your uncredited contributions. You essentially functioned as an unpaid co-founder." She tapped the emails. "And this affair gives us leverage for a fault-based divorce in a state where that matters. How would you like to proceed?" I felt something shift inside my chest, like a locked door finally opening. "I want everything he thinks is his to actually be mine. Can you do that?" Patricia smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a woman who understood exactly what kind of war we were about to wage. "Mrs. Ashford, it would be my genuine pleasure." The interviews went better than I could have imagined. At Goldman Sachs, the managing director told me my market analysis framework was exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need at the director level. At Morgan Stanley, they offered me the position on the spot, pending background checks. At JP Morgan, the head of the division asked if I'd consider a slightly different role, Chief Strategy Officer for their emerging fintech investments, reporting directly to the executive VP. The salary was $350,000 with equity. I asked for 72 hours to consider all offers. They agreed immediately. But while my professional life was suddenly exploding with possibility, my personal life was disintegrating in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. Brett came home from San Francisco on Wednesday night, kissed my cheek distractedly, and immediately disappeared into his home office for a call with investors. I made dinner, pasta primavera with the expensive parmesan he liked, and set it on his desk without a word. He barely looked up. "Thanks, babe, you're the best." I stood in the doorway watching him for 30 seconds. This man, I'd reorganized my entire existence around, and felt absolutely nothing. Not love, not even hatred yet. Just a cold, analytical distance, like I was observing a specimen under glass. Caroline came over Thursday night after Patricia's consultation. We sat on my bedroom floor with a bottle of Pinot Noir, and I told her everything. The emails, the affair, the attorneys, the job offers. She cried before I did, angry tears streaming down her face. "That absolute bastard," 7 years, Sophia. 7 years of watching him treat you like his assistant instead of his equal, and he was cheating the entire time. I hadn't cried yet. Couldn't. The tears felt locked somewhere behind the rage, behind the planning, behind the cold clarity that had taken over every thought. I need you to do something for me, I said quietly. I need you to keep this secret for exactly 3 more weeks. Can you do that? She understood immediately what I was asking. No confrontation yet. No tipping him off. Let him think everything was normal while I built my case, secured my exit, positioned every piece exactly where it needed to be. Caroline squeezed my hand. 3 weeks. Then we destroy him. The word destroy should have scared me. Instead, it felt like permission. But doubt crept in during the quiet moments. Late at night when Brett slept beside me, sometimes his hand would reach for mine unconsciously, the way it used to when we first got married. In those moments, I'd remember the man I fell in love with, the one who stayed up all night with me when my father died, holding me while I sobbed, the one who used to leave handwritten notes in my work bag telling me how proud he was. That man had existed once, hadn't he? Or had I invented him, projecting qualities onto someone who was always exactly what he appeared to be now? The uncertainty made my chest ache. I almost backed out twice. The first time was when Brett surprised me, with takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant on Friday night, apologizing for being distant. I know I've been distracted lately, Soph. The fundraising is just intense, but I appreciate you. I really do. He looked so sincere, his green eyes meeting mine, with what seemed like genuine affection. For 10 full minutes, I considered whether I was overreacting, whether the affair was a mistake he'd regret, whether our marriage could survive if I just confronted him, went to therapy, tried harder. Then I remembered how he'd introduced me at his company party 3 weeks ago. This is Sophia. She keeps the home fires burning while I build the future. Like I was a domestic appliance. Like my $200,000 career was invisible. The softness in my chest hardened back into steel. The second time was worse. Brett's mother Eleanor called Sunday morning, asking us to brunch at her club. Over eggs, Benedict, and mimosas, she asked about grandchildren with that pointed eagerness. Wealthy mothers-in-law perfect over decades. You're 32 now, Sophia. Brett's company is stabilizing. Seems like the perfect time to start a family. Brett nodded enthusiastically. We've been talking about it, haven't we, babe? We absolutely had not been talking about it. But I smiled and said something vague about timing, while Eleanor described the nursery she'd already planned in their Greenwich estate. Driving home, Brett was energized in a way I hadn't seen in months. A baby would be amazing right now. Really ground us. Ground us. Like I was the one drifting. Like his affair with Vivian was somehow my failure to anchor him properly. That night, alone in the bathroom while Brett played video games in the living room, I stared at my reflection and barely recognized the woman looking back. When had I become someone who smiled through her own erasure? Who nodded along to a future built on lies? Who considered staying just because leaving felt too hard, too public, too much? Like admitting I'd wasted 7 years on the wrong person? I thought about the little girl I used to be, the one who graduated top of her class at NYU, who got recruited by 3 investment banks before graduation, who believed she could do anything if she worked hard enough. That girl would be ashamed of who I'd become. That girl would never have tolerated being made invisible. I owed her the woman I was about to become, the one who didn't just leave, but who made sure everyone understood. Exactly why. The pieces started connecting in ways I hadn't initially anticipated. On Monday morning, I accepted the position at J.P. Morgan, Chief Strategy Officer, FinTech Investments Division, $350,000 base salary, $200,000 signing bonus, equity package that vested over 4 years. My start date was May 1st, exactly 6 weeks away, enough time to execute everything I'd been planning. Richard Chen from Goldman called an hour later, disappointed but understanding. If you ever want to make a move, Sophia, call me first. You're going to do incredible things. That same afternoon, I received an email from Jason Whitfield, Brett's co-founder. We'd always maintained a cordial relationship, the kind where we made polite conversation at company events but never discussed anything substantial. His message was carefully worded, almost nervous. Sophia, could we meet for coffee? There's something I need to discuss with you regarding the company, preferably without Brett knowing. My stomach dropped. I suggested a Starbucks in Cambridge, far from anywhere Brett's tech crowd frequented. We met Wednesday at 2. Jason looked exhausted, shadows under his eyes like he hadn't slept properly in weeks. He ordered a black coffee, and we sat in the back corner, away from other customers. "I'm leaving the company," he said without preamble, filing paperwork to dissolve the partnership by end of month. I kept my face neutral, even as my mind raced. "Why?" He ran his hand through his hair, a gesture of pure frustration. "Because Brett's been cooking the books. Not dramatically, nothing that would trigger SEC investigation, but enough that our investor reporting is misleading. He's been inflating our user growth numbers by about 18%, claiming enterprise deals that are still in negotiation as closed revenue, accelerating recognition timelines to make quarters look better than they are." The financial analyst in me immediately understood the implications. "That's securities fraud if you've taken investment money based on false metrics." Jason nodded miserably. "Exactly. And I refused to sign off on the latest investor update. Brett told me I was being paranoid, that everyone in tech stretches numbers, that it's just aggressive accounting. But Sophia, it's not aggressive. It's fraudulent. I can't be part of it." He pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. "These are copies of the real financials versus what Brett's been reporting. I thought you should know before this explodes. You're married to him. You could be liable if investors sue." I took the folder, my hands steady even though my heart was pounding. Inside were spreadsheets showing the discrepancies Jason described. Brett's reported monthly recurring revenue, $423,000. Actual MRR, $307,000. Claimed annual growth rate, 89%. Real growth rate, 52%. Still respectable numbers, but nowhere near the hockey stick trajectory Brett had been selling. "Does anyone else know about this?" Jason shook his head. "Just me, you, and Brett. The rest of the team works on individual components. Nobody else sees the full picture. But Sophia, when Series B investors do due diligence, they'll find it. This will come out." I thought about Patricia Morrison, about the divorce case we were building, about how this information fundamentally changed everything. "Thank you for telling me, Jason. I appreciate your integrity." He looked relieved, like he'd been carrying this weight alone for too long. "I'm sorry you're married to him. You deserve better." The comment caught me off guard, its sincerity unexpected. "You always treated everyone with respect, did actual work while Brett took credit, never complained even when he was obviously taking advantage. The whole team noticed. For what it's worth, we all think you're the competent one in that relationship." After Jason left, I sat in that Starbucks for 45 minutes, studying the financial documents, my analytical brain connecting implications like dominoes falling. Brett had committed securities fraud. That made him vulnerable, not just in divorce court, but potentially criminally. It also meant the company equity I'd been planning to claim as part of the divorce settlement was worth substantially less than the inflated valuation Brett believed it had. The $4 million Series A had been raised on legitimate metrics, but if Series B was being pursued with fraudulent numbers and that fraud was discovered, investors could sue for rescission. The company could be worthless within months. I called Patricia Morrison from my car. "We need to adjust our strategy. I'm sending you financial documents that change everything." That evening, she called back after reviewing the materials. "Sophia, this is remarkable. Not only do we have leverage for the divorce, we have enough evidence to potentially shield you from any liability associated with his fraud. We can file before the Series B closes, establish that you had no knowledge of the fraudulent reporting, and position you as a victim of his deception rather than a complicit spouse." Her voice took on an edge of excitement. "Better yet, we can use this to negotiate a clean break with no claim to company equity, which actually protects you from the impending disaster while he remains fully exposed." The irony was almost poetic. Brett had spent 7 years claiming I didn't understand his business, patronizing me about tech and startups and disruption. Meanwhile, he'd been running a fraudulent operation that any competent financial analyst would have spotted immediately. I'd spent my career identifying exactly these kinds of discrepancies in public companies. He'd been committing the most basic form of securities fraud right under my nose, assuming I was too focused on my little spreadsheets to notice or care. He'd underestimated me catastrophically, and that miscalculation was about to cost him absolutely everything. Everything accelerated the week before my birthday. Brett announced on Monday that he'd secured commitments for Series B funding, $12 million led by Madison Chen at Pearson Sterling Ventures, with participation from 2 other firms. He was ecstatic, opening a bottle of Veuve Clicquot at 7 a.m, kissing me with champagne-soaked enthusiasm. "We did it, Soph," This changes everything. The company's valued at $48 million now. $48 million. I smiled and toasted with orange juice, my mind calculating rapidly. $48 million based on fraudulent metrics. Madison Chen and her investors were about to put $12 million into a company built on lies, and they had no idea. I should have felt guilty. Some residual loyalty to the man I'd married should have compelled me to warn him, to stop this before it became criminal. Conspiracy to commit securities fraud. But when I opened my mouth to speak, what came out was, "That's incredible, honey. You've worked so hard for this." The words tasted like ash, or maybe like freedom. I couldn't tell the difference anymore. Tuesday, Vivian called the house phone. I was working from home, analyzing market data for a client portfolio, when our landline rang. We barely used it, mostly just for delivery confirmations and spam calls. "Hi, is Brett available?" Her voice was young, musical, with a slight uptalk that made everything sound like a question. "He's at the office," I said calmly. "Can I take a message?" There was a pause, the kind of silence that's louder than words. "Oh, you're Sophia." Another pause. "I'm Vivian, from the company. We're working on the Series B materials together." The lie was so transparent it was almost insulting. My hand tightened on the phone. "I know exactly who you are, Vivian. I've read every email between you and my husband for the past 9 months. Every hotel reservation. Every explicit message." The silence stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. Then, quietly, almost a whisper, "I'm sorry. I didn't..." He said you two were basically separated, that the marriage was over in everything but paperwork. Of course he did. The oldest lie in the cheater's playbook. "We have dinner together every night. We sleep in the same bed. We're planning our family. Does that sound separated to you?" Vivian started crying. These small, hiccuping sobs that should have made me feel victorious, but instead just made me feel tired. Tired of Brett's lies infecting everything, destroying people I'd never even met. "He told me he loved me," she said through tears. "He said after the Series B closed, he'd leave you, that we'd be together." I almost laughed. The audacity of it, the sheer predictability. "Vivian, he's not leaving me. I'm leaving him. And when I do, you'll realize you didn't win anything worth having. You're welcome to Somme." The ruins. I hung up before she could respond. My hands were shaking, not from sadness or jealousy, but from rage so pure it felt like my blood was carbonated, fizzing under my skin. I'd spent 7 years building Brett up, sacrificing my own ambitions, making myself smaller so he could feel bigger, and he'd repaid me with calculated cruelty, with systematic erasure, with a 24-year-old he promised futures he never intended to deliver. The betrayal was almost secondary to the insult of how predictable it all was. Wednesday, Patricia called with news. "The divorce papers are ready. Everything's filed and scheduled. We can serve him whenever you're ready." I thought about timing, about maximum impact, about the birthday dinner Brett had insisted on planning, claiming he wanted to celebrate me properly for once. 50 people at Bellamy's, the most expensive restaurant in Boston. All his investors, his team, his cronies from the tech scene. My birthday as another stage for him to perform on. "Serve him at the dinner," I said. "Friday night, in front of everyone." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Sophia, that's extremely public. Are you certain? It will be humiliating for him." The cold satisfaction that spread through my chest should have scared me, should have made me reconsider. Instead, it felt like justice crystallizing into something tangible I could hold. "He's humiliated me publicly for 7 years. He gets 1 night of the same treatment, I'm certain." She agreed to coordinate with a process server who could blend with restaurant staff. Thursday night, Brett brought home flowers, peonies my favorite, arranged in an expensive crystal vase, for my beautiful wife before the big celebration tomorrow. He kissed my forehead, and I let him, studying his face like I was memorizing someone I'd never see again. He looked so pleased with himself, so certain of his world, so completely unaware that in 24 hours, everything he thought was solid would turn to smoke. I should have slept that night but couldn't. I lay in the dark listening to Brett's breathing beside me, feeling the weight of 7 years pressing on my chest. 7 years of being told I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too ambitious, not ambitious enough, too focused on my career, not supportive enough of his. 7 years of shape-shifting myself into whatever he needed me to be at any given moment, only to discover it was never enough, because the problem wasn't me. It was never me. The problem was him. And tomorrow, everyone would finally see it. I got up at 4:30 Friday morning and went for a run along the Charles River. The April air was cold enough to burn my lungs, the sunrise turning the water gold and pink. My legs carried me faster than usual, endorphins and adrenaline mixing into something that felt almost like flying. By the time I returned to the brownstone, Brett was still sleeping. I showered, dressed in the black silk dress I'd bought, specifically for tonight, and put on the diamond earrings he'd given me for our 5th anniversary. If I was going to burn his world down, I'd do it looking unforgettable. The afternoon crawled by with excruciating slowness. Every minute felt like an hour, every hour like a day. I tried to work, reviewing portfolio analyses that suddenly seemed irrelevant compared to what was coming. My mind kept jumping ahead to tonight, rehearsing what I'd say, how I'd stand, where I'd look. Caroline texted at 2. "Are you really doing this?" I typed back immediately. Every single word of it. She sent 3 flame emojis in a single sentence. "I'm so proud of you I could cry." At 5, I started getting ready with the same methodical precision I brought to financial analyses. Hair straightened until it fell like dark water down my back. Makeup dramatic, smoky eyes and red lips. The kind of look that photographs well because I knew this would be photographed. Someone would post this on social media. Someone would capture the moment. I wanted to look powerful in those images, not broken. The black dress fit perfectly, hugging curves I'd maintained through stress and anxiety that should have destroyed my appetite, but instead made me compulsively disciplined about everything, including my body. Brett came home at 6, already in his suit from the office, smelling like expensive cologne and confidence. "You look stunning, Soph. Absolutely stunning." He kissed my cheek, his hand on my waist. Possessive and familiar. I wondered if Vivian had called him crying, if he knew I knew everything. His face betrayed nothing except excitement for his performance tonight. "Everyone's going to be there," Madison confirmed. "She's bringing her senior partner. Jason's coming too." My stomach twisted at Jason's name. I thought Jason was leaving the company. Brett's expression flickered, something dark passing across his features before the smile returned. "He's being dramatic about some accounting. Disagreements. I'll handle it. Tonight's not about internal politics. It's about celebrating you and our success." Our success. The phrase was so absurd I almost laughed. My success was happening independently, invisibly, while he claimed credit for achievements that existed only on fraudulent spreadsheets. "What time do we need to leave?" I asked, my voice steady despite my heart hammering. 7:15. Cars coming at 7. The black SUV arrived exactly on time. We rode to Bellamy's in silence. Brett scrolling through his phone, probably texting Vivian reassurances or Madison final details about the funding. I watched Boston pass by the tinted windows, the city lights beginning to glow in the dusk, and felt strangely detached from my own body, like I was watching myself in a movie, waiting for the climax I'd already read in the script. My hands were folded in my lap, perfectly still. My breathing was controlled, but inside my chest, my heart was a drum counting down to detonation. Bellamy's occupied the top floor of a historic building in the financial district, all exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. We stepped off the elevator into warm light and the sound of conversation already in progress. The private dining room Brett had reserved seated 60, though he'd said 50 were coming. I scanned faces as we entered. Madison Chen in a burgundy dress talking to her senior partner. Brett's entire executive team clustered near the bar. Eleanor, Brett's mother, in pearls and judgment. Caroline near the windows, catching my eye and nodding once. Jason standing alone, looking uncomfortable, our coffee conversation hanging unspoken between us. Brett guided me to the head of the table, his hand on the small of my back, playing the attentive husband for his audience. Everyone turned to watch us, applause rippling through the room. "Happy birthday, Sophia," someone called out. Brett raised his glass in acknowledgement, soaking in the attention that was supposedly directed at me. I smiled and waved, feeling the weight of the envelope in my clutch, the divorce papers Patricia had given me this afternoon, feeling the weight of what was coming in approximately 90 minutes, after appetizers and entrees and the dessert Brett had specially ordered. We sat, servers circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Brett held court, talking loudly about the Series B, about company valuation, about his vision for disrupting the Hague industry. Madison Chen listened with the polite interest investors perfect, asking occasional questions. I noticed her glancing at me periodically, like she was trying to reconcile the wife she'd heard about with the woman sitting silently at the head of the table in a dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The first course arrived. Oysters on ice, mignonette sauce, lemon wedges arranged artfully. Brett made a toast to my incredible wife Sophia, who's been my rock through all of this, who keeps our home running while I build our future. There was that phrase again. Our future, built on my invisible labor and his visible fraud. People raised glasses. I raised mine, the champagne catching light like liquid gold, and felt time slow down to individual seconds I could count like heartbeats. Carolyn moved closer, taking the seat next to mine that had been reserved for Eleanor. She leaned in, her voice barely a whisper. The server just confirmed. She's ready whenever you give the signal. I nodded imperceptibly. The signal was simple. When dessert was served, I'd stand. That's all. Just stand. And everything I'd built over the past 3 weeks would cascade into reality like a controlled demolition. Entrees arrived. Filet mignon, roasted vegetables, truffle butter sauce that probably cost $40 a plate. Brett was animated, gesturing with his fork, telling stories where he was always the hero. I cut my steak into precise pieces and chewed mechanically. Tasting nothing, my entire awareness focused on the moment approaching like a wave I could see building on the horizon. Inevitable. Devastating. Finally mine to control. Dessert arrived at 9:47. Chocolate torte with gold leaf, fresh raspberries, and a single candle flickering on my plate. The room sang happy birthday, 50 voices blending into something that should have been joyful, but sounded like a funeral dirge to my ears. I blew out the candle, made no wish because I didn't need wishes anymore, and stood slowly. The conversations died immediately. Everyone turned to look at me, expecting a thank you speech, maybe some tears of gratitude for Brett's generosity in throwing this party. Thank you all for coming tonight, I began, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room. I know Brett invited you here to celebrate my birthday, and I appreciate that, but I have some announcements that I think will make this evening much more memorable than anyone anticipated. Brett's smile faltered slightly. I could see confusion in his eyes, uncertainty creeping into his confident posture. I reached into my clutch and withdrew the envelope, setting it on the table in front of me like a weapon. First, I want to share some professional news. As of May 1st, I'll be starting as Chief Strategy Officer of FinTech Investments at JP Morgan. $350,000 salary, $200,000 signing bonus, plus equity. It's the culmination of a career I've been building quietly while my husband has spent 7 years telling anyone who'd listen that I dabble in spreadsheets. I saw Madison Chen's eyebrows rise, saw Eleanor's mouth open slightly, saw Caroline grinning so widely she looked like she might burst. Second, I need to address something that affects several people in this room, particularly you, Madison. I looked directly at the venture capitalist who just committed $12 million to Brett's company. I have evidence that the financial metrics Brett presented to secure your Series B investment are fraudulent. User growth inflated by 18%. Revenue recognition accelerated inappropriately. Enterprise deals reported as closed when they're still in negotiation. The company is worth substantially less than the $48 million valuation you agreed to. The room exploded. Brett shot to his feet. Sophia, what the hell are you doing? His face had gone completely white. Madison was already on her phone, presumably texting her partners. Her senior partner was staring at Brett with an expression that could have frozen fire. I continued calmly, pulling documents from my clutch. I have the real financials here, provided by Jason Whitfield, who left the company specifically because he refused to participate in securities fraud. Actual monthly recurring revenue is $307,000, not the $423,000 Brett reported. Actual annual growth rate is 52%, not 89%. Still respectable numbers, but nowhere near what was represented to investors. Jason stood, his face grim. It's all true. I gave Sophia those documents because I couldn't be complicit anymore. Brett's been cooking the books for 8 months. Madison's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. We'll be conducting immediate forensic accounting. If this is accurate, Brett, our investment agreement includes fraud provisions. We can rescind the entire deal and potentially pursue criminal charges. Brett was shaking, his hands gripping the back of his chair so hard his knuckles were bone white. This is insane. Sophia doesn't know what she's talking about. She's never understood the business. I smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. I'm a financial analyst who manages a $200 million portfolio, Brett. I've spent 10 years identifying exactly this kind of fraud in public companies. You committed the most basic form of securities fraud and assumed I wouldn't notice because you've spent our entire marriage convincing yourself I'm incompetent. I picked up the second set of documents. But we're not done yet, because the financial fraud isn't even the most interesting part of tonight. For the past 9 months, Brett has been having an affair with Vivian Thornton, a marketing coordinator at his company. I have documentation of hotel stays, explicit emails, text messages. He told her he was leaving me after the Series B closed. He told me we were planning to start a family. He's been lying systematically to everyone in his life while presenting himself as this visionary entrepreneur with strong values. Eleanor gasped audibly. Several people pulled out their phones, already typing what I assumed were messages spreading this nuclear gossip through Boston's tech scene. Brett found his voice, desperate now. Sophia, please. Let's discuss this privately. You're embarrassing yourself. The condescension in his tone, even now, even while his life was burning down, was almost impressive. No, Brett. You've embarrassed me privately for 7 years. You've diminished my career, taken credit for my work, treated me like an accessory to your ambition. You introduced me to your investors as someone who keeps the home fires burning when I make more money than you do and have more actual professional accomplishments than you've ever achieved. I opened the envelope and withdrew the divorce papers, laying them on the table. These are divorce papers. They cite your adultery, document your fraudulent business practices to protect me from liability, and request zero claim to your company equity, because that equity is about to be worthless when Madison's team uncovers the full extent of your fraud. I pulled out a pen and signed my name on the indicated lines, my signature steady and clear. I'm done being invisible in my own marriage. I'm done watching you perform success, built on my labor and your lies. The server I'd coordinated with stepped forward, exactly as planned, placing a second set of papers in front of Brett. Official service of divorce, legal, and binding. Brett stared at them like they were written in a foreign language. 6 months later, I stood in my corner office on the 42nd floor of J.P. Morgan's headquarters, looking out over the Boston skyline, and barely recognized the woman I'd been at that birthday dinner. That woman had been so compressed, so diminished, she'd almost forgotten she was capable of taking up space. This woman, the one reflected in the floor-to-ceiling windows, stood tall in a tailored suit that cost more than Brett used to spend on me in a year, and she looked exactly like what she was. Powerful, competent, finally completely free. Brett's company collapsed within 8 weeks of that dinner. Madison Chen's forensic accounting team found even more discrepancies than I'd documented, irregularities going back nearly 2 years. The Series B was rescinded immediately. The Series A investors filed a lawsuit for fraud and misrepresentation. Brett settled for an undisclosed amount that I heard through Caroline's network, involved him surrendering all his equity and agreeing to a 5-year ban from serving as an officer in any venture-backed company. He was essentially unhireable in Boston's tech scene. Last I heard, he'd moved back to Greenwich, living in his mother's guest house, working at a startup consultancy for a fraction of what he used to make. Eleanor stopped calling me, which was possibly the best outcome of the entire situation. Vivian Thornton left the company before it imploded, got a job at a legitimate marketing firm, and sent me an apology email 3 months after the dinner. It was thoughtful, taking real accountability, explaining that she'd been manipulated, but understood that didn't excuse her choices. I never responded. Some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt. They're meant to be lessons about what foundations were never solid to begin with. I hope she learned something. I hope she finds someone who doesn't need to diminish others to feel significant. But her journey isn't my responsibility anymore. Jason Whitfield became one of my closest friends. We have coffee every other Tuesday, and he's thriving as CTO of a biotech startup that's actually legitimate, actually doing important work in drug discovery algorithms. He told me once that testifying about Brett's fraud was the hardest thing he'd ever done professionally, but also the most important. It taught me that integrity isn't negotiable, even when the cost is high. I respected that. I respected him for choosing truth when silence would have been easier. Caroline stood next to me as maid of honor when I married someone new 2 years later. But that's getting ahead of the story. First, I had to learn how to be alone without being lonely, how to fill my apartment with my own thoughts, instead of someone else's opinions about who I should be, how to cook dinner for one without it feeling like failure, how to wake up on Saturday mornings and do exactly what I wanted without negotiating, compromising, or shrinking myself to fit someone else's vision of my life. That took time. It took therapy. It took journal entries and long runs along the Charles River, and nights where I cried for the years I'd lost, before I remembered I hadn't lost them. I'd survived them, and survival is its own kind of victory. My career exploded in ways I'd never imagined. At JP Morgan, I led a team that identified emerging fintech opportunities in Southeast Asian markets, investments that generated $467 million in returns over 3 years. I was promoted to senior vice president within 18 months. I spoke at conferences. I mentored young women analysts who reminded me of who I used to be, and I told them the truth. Nobody had told me at 26. You don't have to. Make yourself smaller for anyone. Not for love, not for marriage, not for any man who needs you diminished to feel powerful. Your competence isn't a threat to the right person. It's a gift. The divorce was finalized 4 months after that dinner, uncontested, because Brett had no leverage to contest anything. I kept my retirement accounts, my savings, and my career momentum. He kept the debt from his legal settlements and the reputation of being the tech founder who committed fraud. Sometimes I see his name in industry publications, usually as a cautionary tale about inflated metrics and founder hubris. I feel nothing when I see it. Not satisfaction, not vindication. Just the distant recognition of someone who used to occupy space in my life and now doesn't. Like looking at furniture from an old apartment you've long since moved out of. What I learned from those 7 years with Brett isn't that all men are untrustworthy, or that marriage is a trap. What I learned is that I'd rather be alone and respected than partnered and invisible. That being underestimated is only a disadvantage if you believe the underestimation, instead of weaponizing it. That revenge isn't always about destruction. Sometimes it's about construction, building yourself into someone so undeniably successful that the person who dismissed you has to live with knowing they were catastrophically wrong about your potential. On my 36th birthday, exactly 4 years after that dinner at Bellamy's, I had lunch with 3 women from my team. We ate Thai food in the conference room and talked about market opportunities and someone's terrible Tinder date and the new analyst who showed exceptional promise. Nobody made speeches about my competence or lack thereof. Nobody diminished my career or treated my success as surprising. I was just Sofia Castellano, SVP of Emerging Markets, eating pad thai, and being exactly who I'd always been underneath the performance of being Brett's wife. That's the real ending. Not the dramatic dinner where I burned his world down, though that was necessary and satisfying, and something I'd do again without hesitation. The real ending is the quiet afternoon 4 years later where I realized I'd become so completely myself that I couldn't remember what it felt like to be anyone else. If you've ever been told you're too much, or not enough by someone who claimed to love you, I want you to know something. They were wrong. You were never the problem. And the moment you realize that, the moment you choose yourself with the same fierce commitment you once gave them, that's when your real story begins. That's when you become who you were always meant to be, before someone convinced you to be smaller. Subscribe if this story resonated with you. Share it with someone who needs to hear that their competence isn't a flaw, it's a superpower. And remember, being underestimated by the wrong person is just preparation for being celebrated by the right ones. The best revenge isn't making them suffer. It's building a life so full and extraordinary that they become irrelevant to your happiness. That's the victory that lasts.